Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is where I look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to do a movie review, but just to focus entirely on the film's 3D, with maybe just some brief thoughts at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at the 2018 MCU film Black Panther. It's got a variable aspect ratio, switching between 2.39 to 1 and 1.9 to 1. I know a lot of people love this, and they'll be happy to see quite a few scenes here opened up at the top and bottom. Like all of the Marvel films, and I think everything under the Disney umbrella, the 3D here was post-converted, and certainly by Phase 3, the conversions being done on the MCU films were pretty much state-of-the-art. They don't shy away from putting a decent amount of depth into the image most of the time. I guess one of the reasons behind this is that these films were generating such massive box office numbers that the budget for strong 3D was safely in place, and I think it's fairly basic economics with post-converted 3D in that the stronger you want it, the more it's going to cost. Obviously there are plenty of other factors that dictate how good it's going to look and how well it's going to work, but if you've got bags of cash, you're off to a good start. And speaking of getting off to a good start, right at the beginning there's a nice shot of the vibranium meteorite, and I really like this, as not only does this lump of rock sit in its own 3D space as it travels through space, but I like the way that the Earth is clearly separated from the starfield backdrop too. And there's a great long shot exposition piece telling the story of Wakanda, which is a beautifully crafted sequence full of depth and solidity. I'm sure that the film's tone isn't supposed to make me feel any great affection for war machines, but it's nice to see a Spitfire in a little dogfight there. I did notice a tiny conversion error in this sequence where these sword-fighting guys aren't placed in quite the right space, but that's no kind of problem at all. The one or two other conversion errors that made themselves noticeable were barely a distraction. There was the usual problem with trees smearing away over each other, but nothing in any way horrible. I did also think there were a couple of moments where there were things in the shot that caused the 3D problems, the kind of thing that an on-set stereographer would presumably look out for and slightly rearrange the shot to avoid the issue, like the spears here. The foreground one in focus sits both to the immediate left and right of the outer focus one. It's one of those views that slightly messes with the brain's processing of 3D, I think with too much conflicting information, and same sort of thing with the bright orange vertical line by the curtains. It's bang in the middle of the screen and sits to the left of his face in one eye, but it's obscured by him in the other, which again is obviously too big a difference to resolve in 3D. Like the conversion errors though, these are extremely minor and not worth mentioning at all, unless you're some sort of stereo geek who's only interested in banging on about every aspect of the film's 3D. Something that I think 3D films don't do often enough is to make character introductions an effective piece of 3D, and this film seems to understand that, and we get a couple of nice ones, like the first Black Panther introduction. He appears out of the darkness and has a very solid and three-dimensional mask, and then when we first see the star of the show, his face is solidly sculpted with accurate volume, and the natural air of dignity that Chadwick Boseman possesses here feels all the more tangible thanks to the 3D. There are quite a lot of views of streets in the film, and even when they're fairly empty, there's a good sense of depth in the shot. So here, for example, the depth is mainly conveyed just by the way the road stretches away into the screen, and it's even better when the street is packed with detail, so the bustling Wakandan street scene has a lot going on in 3D space, and better still I think in Korea, with the crowds and signs placed into their own distinct 3D space, plus this is where the drama's being dialed up a bit, so as ever, better 3D at more dramatic moments is where I think the process is at its best. And that doesn't just mean action sequences, as what I think is one of the best uses of 3D in the film happens in this location, which is a great piece of design when it comes to architecture that looks good in 3D, but throw in both strong visuals as well as something dramatic, and this place offers up a fantastic 3D shot, one of my favourites in the film. And another really lovely view, nothing flashy, no action, but this shot of the two of them sitting in the Wakandan landscape is gorgeous in 3D, and I think the way it clearly places them within the landscape feels like it emphasises the point that they're part of this place, that a country shapes and defines its people. This would be a great 3D landscape shot even with no one in it, but I think it becomes far more effective with the two of them placed in there. There's a nice slightly hyper stereo view above Wakanda that I thought was pretty effective, because it's one of the times times we see the really advanced technology of the place sitting alongside its more traditional way of life. So doing this in a shot with good strong stereo helps to give it more of a sense of being a relevant site. So I think there's a load of very nice 3D in this film, sometimes not remotely story relevant perhaps, or even maybe not shot with 3D in mind, just very pleasing, like this flock of birds with very clear space between them and the water. It's very reminiscent of a near identical 3D view in Aquaman. There are lots of nice 3D spears seen from various angles, which lets the 3D show them off in various ways. So there's the more subtle composition, like these views, and there's the more in-your-face stuff, like this when they pop them out of the screen. One of these is done a bit clumsily maybe, and it makes you wonder if consideration for 3D on the day it was shot was perhaps not a priority, so it breaks the screen quite badly here. But they managed to do a better version of the same shot here, and obviously the spear is jutting away out of the screen. And if you make a 3D film with guns in it, then you have to include at least one shot of one of them being held out, popping out of the screen. It's the law. Probably the most overt piece of pop-out happens towards the end of the film, involving a dagger that's maybe in danger of attracting the accusation of gimmick 3D shot, but it was fun and I enjoyed it, even if it was a bit obvious. There are some cityscapes where there's some hyperstereos, so the view of the Wakanda city here is quite nice. There's plenty of depth, although I don't think there's a huge amount of separation between all of the buildings. But when one of their craft flies over it, the thing is very strongly in its own space. Less exotic maybe, but also slightly hyperstereo is this view in South Korea. Maybe it's less effective because other than the buildings sort of towards the right of the screen, the backdrop of the city is fairly flat. Same sort of thing in this nighttime view of Busan, where it's really only the foreground buildings that sit in separate 3D space, although at least they get rid of the text telling us where it is for just about long enough to appreciate the unspoiled view, which unfortunately doesn't happen in what I think is the best hyperstereo view in the film. So this shot of London is full of depth and separation between the buildings, and also if you've seen the 3D film XXX, The Return of Xander Cage, one of the things in it that stood out was a pitiful view of the London skyline that was spectacularly amateurish and badly composed. This, on the other hand, is an excellent view, capturing the London skyline and putting it into very strong 3D space. Unfortunately, it's spoiled by that text, which is there the whole time. Also, I think this text is one of the film's less successful attempts at authentic world building, as it just comes across as the kind of thing a schoolboy might come up with. It's a simple code where each letter of the Latin alphabet is just replaced by a Wakandan symbol, rather than being a language in its own right. Anyway, I think the text does all rather detract from an otherwise excellent 3D view. I would add that I don't think these cityscape hyperstereos here are quite up to the quality of that stunning view of Manhattan in Doctor Strange. And speaking of Doctor Strange, there was a great shot in that film where his veins were visible beneath his skin, and this could have been a similar thing, but the blue here sits on his skin without being placed into 3D space beyond it, which is where it feels to me like it ought to be, so that's maybe a bit of a shame. Another minor disappointment for me, maybe related to those Wakandan symbols, is we get glimpses of these quite cool looking walls with the floating blue symbols in them, but unfortunately we never get a particularly good 3D shot of them, which is a pity as I think they look like an excellent bit of production design for 3D. Other pieces of production design that could look great in 3D are absolutely fully exploited and excellent, like these hanging sticks which the camera travels through in between. This is superb, and the light posts on the track here, this also looks sensational, with every one of those posts sitting in its own space stretching away back into the screen. I do wonder how naive I'm being when I assume that a place like this is a location. I mean, I'm sure there are many places just like this that exist in the real world, but would they have arranged these old aircraft somewhere just for this shot? Or could it all just be CGI these days? I don't know, but wherever or whatever this is, these derelict fuselages make for a great 3D view. Also, a small-scale example of where I'm not sure what's going on is this. They know the film's going to get a 3D conversion, so I assume the wire mesh here, which is very clearly in separate space to the two of them, just wasn't there when they shot the scene, but was added in afterwards digitally to save several $1,000s of tricky conversion work. That's how I would have thought they'd do it anyway, but who knows. One of the times in the film where it's an example of how much more sense the shot makes in 3D is an excellent view when they enter a club and there are loads of spherical lights hanging down, all of which are spread brilliantly across 3D space, and when seen in 2D, the degree to which these lamps are less noticeable is genuinely startling. Another little thing I really liked is the menacing approach of a rival tribe appearing from a dark cave within the screen and emerging out of that into closer 3D space. That happens during one of the challenge fight scenes, and there are several great 3D views in these sequences, especially looking down on the fight or looking back up at the crowd. I know that this shot and others like it have been criticised for looking a bit like the crowd had been copied and pasted in, but I wonder if that's more due to the limited amount of costume design rather than a limited amount of extras. Best of all, looking down on the fight when it's perched on the edge of the waterfall, huge amounts of depth in these views of extreme peril, and they also do give us the great 3D view of someone falling down here. And there's an even better fall sequence during another fight, with the camera following the two of them as they continue scrapping on their way down, and again with a Doctor Strange comparison. This is no match for that incredible fall in that film, as this one doesn't do anything like that film's zoom dolly style stretching of the background, but then again that is one of 3D cinema's greatest moments, I think, and this is merely an excellent one. The film's not overloaded with obvious pop-out, but there's plenty going on in negative parallax, like the dragonfly-type craft here as it flies into the frame, and this shot progresses into one of several excellent moves through a long, enclosed space. So I think Black Panther sits up there with the rock-solid, strong and deep 3D conversions. Perhaps not quite one of the all-time greats, but still top-tier stuff. There's just a very quick word about the film itself. I've nothing against them, but I'm not the most massive of Marvel fans, and whilst I've seen all of them, I'm not sort of on the spot when it comes to knowing them all inside out and how everything fits together, so I definitely appreciate the standalone films that work entirely in their own right. Now, maybe this one was chock full of references to the others that just passed me by, but to me, it played out as a nicely self-contained story, and there was definitely some interesting stuff going on here with the film's bad guy not only having a point, but also having an effect on the behaviour and arc of the hero. I did think that maybe Michael Jordan's villainous swagger was a tiny bit overdone, and his character might have been more powerful and compelling without some of his more casual murders. But he was a bad guy who managed to be simultaneously fun as well as genuinely interesting. I suppose this has been significantly the most important of the Marvel films from a cultural and political point of view, and by 2018, a film like this had been maybe both long overdue and at the same time desperately relevant. On its release, I think it became one of those films that was almost beyond criticism, but I don't think it's culturally insensitive to say maybe some of the CGI felt a little bit cheap, and T'Challa's antagonist took a long time to assert himself into the story. And I know comic book movies have to have a certain quota of action, but once or twice I thought these scenes felt like they were unnecessary and intruded into the drama a bit too much. It's one of those films which, in spite of me droning on about it for the last few minutes, it almost feels too petty to talk about just in terms of how good its 3D is. It's an important film to have been made, and a significant milestone in blockbuster cinema. So it's such a good thing that in making the film that was going to have that on its shoulders, they also managed to serve up a fun, engaging, and even thought-provoking story. Somehow, though, with what happened in 2020, that was all eclipsed by something much more serious, and the heart of this movie really does come from its star, and Chadwick Boseman's performance is understated and dignified, he's charming and charismatic, and when the news of his death hit the world in August 2020, it was as heartbreaking as it was shocking. By literally every account, he was a great guy, and whilst to have carried a film that genuinely created waves is a legacy more than most people leave, him being denied the opportunity to ride those waves for a lot longer is such a cruel tragedy. You don't have to have any special faith to find the scenes here of him walking the ancestral plane incredibly moving now, and leaving you with at the very least a lump in your throat. And I'm just grateful that his chosen path in life was to become an actor, and that somewhere along that path he hooked up with Ryan Coogler, and that the pair of them made a film about the Black Panther, and gave such a huge weight, power and importance to its rallying cry of Wakanda forever. It'll be a tiny footnote in the history of the film, and probably rightly so, that it was released in 3D, but notwithstanding everything that it offered, I'm glad that it also played such a good role in our little world of 3D fandom too. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one. Cheers for now. Bye bye.